Good afternoon from New York City at Columbia University Harriman Institute. We'd like to welcome you to today's event. First of all, I want to tell you about the Harriman Institute at Columbia University, which is one of the world's leading academic institutions devoted to Russian, Eurasian, and East European studies. Our mission is to serve our community at the university and beyond by supporting research, instruction, and dialogue, sponsoring vibrant and multidisciplinary events that bring together our extraordinary resources of faculty, students, and alumni. We are committed to training the next generation of regional specialists to play leadership roles in setting the academic and scholarly agenda, making policy and challenging accepted truths about how we study our rapidly changing world. My name is Tanya Domi, and I teach in our Balkan Studies program, and I am delighted to welcome our guest today, Dr. Andi Hoxhaj, who's going to give us a book talk, which we have long awaited. We had scheduled this a year ago, and the pandemic delayed this opportunity. But let me first tell you about Dr. Hoxhaj. He's a teaching fellow in law at the University of Warwick. His research focuses on corruption, governance, the rule of law, European integration, and the Western Balkans. His work on corruption, good governance, EU enlargement policy, and the migration of young people in the Western Balkans were referred to in parliamentary inquiry in a report, The UK and the Future of the Western Balkans, published by the United Kingdom Parliament in 2018. In April 2018, Dr. Hoxhaj was awarded by the British Academy the prestigious award, British Academy Rising Star Engagement Award, funding his project, the UK Western Balkans Post-Brexit. Dr. Hoxhaj is an author of the book entitled, which is today's discussion, The EU Anti-Corruption Report, a Reflexive Governance Approach, published with Routledge in 2020. He was awarded his doctoral title in 2017 at the University of Warwick. Let me tell you quickly about the book, The EU Anti-Corruption Policy. Dr. Hoxhaj's new book, The EU Anti-Corruption Report, a reflexive governance approach, offers an in-depth study of successes and failures in the evolution of European-wide anti-corruption program and analyses of the development of anti-corruption as a policy field in the European Union. So without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Andi Hoxhaj, and you now have the chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Domi, for your kind invitation, and to Columbia University, and also thank you to Clary for organizing this event. And I'm very delighted to join you, even though virtually from our homes, but I hope we will be able to meet soon in New York. And also thank you to the audience for joining us this afternoon and lunch over in New York. So I'm going to present a little bit about the book today, and it would be a presentation about two chapters in particular. So the first chapter, which is the historical chapter, and then we'll have a discussion about Albania and more broadly in terms of what it is. So the book itself, it's it's divided into three parts, as you can see from the PowerPoint. So the first part, it's an historical account, which will be my presentation in the first half. And then there's an in-depth into the EU anti-corruption report, which is an instrument and mechanism which evaluated the best practice and the worst practice within the 28 member states. And then the third chapter, it's a theoretical chapter, which is the reflexive governance approach that I theorize in more depth, the policy. And then I have three country studies, the UK, Romania, and Albania. So the idea at the time was to have an old member state, but now a former member state, the UK, Romania, a new member state, and Albania as a candidate state. And the third part, it's evaluating the failures of so far the mechanism and what can be done in terms of moving on into the future. So the EU really became interested, and which I call it the first phase, in the 1997. And here, pretty much the first document that you can find, it's a European Commission communication on a union against corruption. So here the European Union took interest in corruption, and they came up with a term to say that, well, corruption is an abuse of power to undue benefit and influence. But the EU here in specifically was interested to make corruption more aware that it's going on, but also to make European companies more aware about the issue of corruption. And in particularly, it wanted member states to ban tax deductibility of briberies, because what companies were doing at the time were claiming taxes back by saying that we would pay a bribe in order to get a contract. So this was not seen anymore as ethical as an issue. And in 1999, the European Council decided that, well, we actually, should take on board the European Commission's recommendation and deal with corruption as a financial crime issue, and common standard should be adopted. So it was more in terms of aligning a European common standard throughout. However, that lived quite short, because what happened was that the EU had issue with corruption on its own. And what that meant was that the European Commission in itself had issue with corruption allegation in 1999, and the whole commission resigned, which was led at the time by Santa. And a whistleblower reporter suggested that some of the commissioners were engaged with member states to allocate them better funding programs. And as a result, the commission resigned, and we had Romano Prodi taking over in September of 1999. And the first thing that the commissioner did was to set out clear ethical guidelines in how a European official should conduct themselves. And in addition to that, the European Commission made a new bureau, which they called it the Anti-Corruption Fraud Bureau, known as OLAF, and it had powers to evaluate as well as to investigate corruption within the EU. Like, OLAF didn't have proper legislative power in terms of how it would investigate, and the history of OLAF, it's not a very successful one because it didn't do any proper investigation. And the oversight, which was by the European Parliament, it wasn't really, doing a proper job there. However, OLAF has been transformed, and in 2019, it has become now the European Public Prosecutor Office. And this office will investigate and has more powers to prosecute corruption and misuse of EU funds. Now, unfortunately, not everyone has signed up, and only 22 member states have signed up, and Hungary, Poland, Sweden, Denmark, and Ireland have not signed up to this. And there are some reasons. Some have to do with sovereignty. At least that's what Denmark, Sweden, and Ireland is putting, whereas Hungary and Poland, they think that this prosecutor will be biased towards them. But we can come up to that. And this very much characterizes the second phase. Now, the third phase, it's very much in line with the international development, because in the 2000s, at international level, in particular the UN, the OECD, and so forth, they took corruption more as a policy issue, as well as loan from World Bank, IMF. they had more and more conditions which were related to good governance and anti-corruption programs. So here the European Union said, okay, so how can we be more effective in this field? Because so far there wasn't really a anti-corruption policy field in the EU. They said, well, why don't we join the international efforts and ensure that all of our member states have in place the international standard. So the EU said in the early 2000s that all of the member states should implement all of the international convention, in particular the UN Convention Against Corruption and the OECD. Then in 2003, the European Commission published its second communication, which is called then on a comprehensive EU policy against corruption. So here, the way that corruption was viewed, it changed a little bit. And here they gave a criminal law approach to the issue of corruption. So in the early 90s, it was more of a financial crime approach. Now it was seen more through the criminal law lens. And here they put corruption same as organized crime, that it was a cross-border crime, and therefore it should be treated as such. And here it would allow that member states would have to collaborate more when it comes to issue of corruption. Still to this day, corruption is viewed as something that the member states should do or deal on their own. Well, they could see here that corruption was not knowing any borders and was impacting beyond one specific member state. And in particular, hence my cartoon there, was that this period, it's sort of seen where Berlusconi in Italy was really sort of attacking the judiciary on charges of corruption. And, you know, the EU was not very happy towards those practices. And then here, what they did was they set out 10 general principles to encourage best practice of anti-corruption laws and policies. And these were mostly preventive corruption mechanism. And they were particularly focusing for the countries that joined the EU in 2004. Now, these principles were in form of a soft law. So member states were encouraged to do so, but not that they had to. And they were around issues of integrity, code of ethics, whistleblower protection, and as well as transparency for party financing. I mean, some of these are still ongoing, as we will see in the later stages, but that kind of characterized. Now, the fourth phase of development of the EU anti-corruption policy was around 2007, 2010. So in 2007, we had a specific mechanism, and this was sort of a post-accession mechanism for Bulgaria and Romania. So before any country could join the EU, and afterwards they didn't have to comply anymore with any conditions or anything like that. But for Bulgaria and Romania, they had this mechanism called, and it's still going on, cooperation on verification mechanism. And this mechanism would monitor Bulgaria and Romania's work against corruption, as well as establishing an effective judiciary. And they would get this report every single year. And the reporting and this mechanism, it was not successful because of the mechanism, but it was more of a threat that EU funds would be upheld if they did not comply to some of the recommendation made each year to cooperation and verification mechanism. In the chapter about Romania, I talk quite a bit about the verification mechanism. However, there was some controversy around this, because Bulgaria and Romania were saying, well, why are we being treated like this by being monitored and being singled out, where there are other member states like Greece, Spain, and so forth, and you know, the Eurozone crisis was coming, they are doing same as us or even worse in the Transparency International Index. So why should we only be targeted? Now, in 2009 then, in a meeting which took place about an open and secure Europe, known as sort of the Stockholm program, they said, well, why don't we develop the CVM into not only 2 member states, but 28 member states, and have this EU anti-corruption report, which will evaluate the poor practices, but as well as the best practices. And what it would also do, it would engage experts for all the 20 member states to engage in dialogue with the Commission and member states. And this was also a way to empower civil society to have an input when it comes to establishing anti-corruption legislation, but also policies. And so that was kind of set out, and then they said new directives would come into play, such as the anti-money laundering directive, confiscation, and so forth. Then what happened was in 2014, we had the first EU anti-corruption report, which I talk in depth in the second chapter. So the report itself, we could say that it kind of emphasizes the height of the EU engagement with anti-corruption policy. So here, the EU was really sort of going at it, and they were really keen in developing anti-corruption policy, but also pushing for those efforts in 2004. So the report itself came for the first time with acknowledgement that corruption cost an estimated of 120 billion euros per year. And that figure is disputed. There are some scholars that say that it's far more than that, but the figure itself, it's quite huge. And in the last chapter, I do talk a little bit about how did they come about it and so forth. Now, the report was interesting because it kind of showed and recognized that there are many areas prone to corruption, and not only public procurement or EU funds, but they said also political party funding, it's an issue. Healthcare is an issue. So they were talking about corruption in healthcare back in 2004, but no one really took them serious at the time. And now we can see some of the repercussion. And they said, there was not proper protection of whistleblowers. And I talk about the whistleblower protection in the last chapter, because whistleblowers are quite keen to report corruption. And unfortunately, the study shows that nearly 74% of corruption never gets reported. And the reason being is because whistleblowers, they are not properly protected. And in this time, only 4 countries out of 28 had proper whistleblower protection. And the report here suggested that we should have a wider whistleblower directive, which the directive was then passed in 2019, and it will come into force next year. So I can come back to the report, but the most important part of the report that was a new thing was that here we could see that the Commission was not engaging anymore with the government. So we didn't have any more this sort of top-down approach, but it was also engaging with civil society, with journalists, and so forth. And their input made a real influence in the recommendation that the Commission made, but also it made member states to listen to their own civil societies and to engage with them to create effective anti-corruption policies and legislation, but also the efforts, because we couldn't have sort of a one fix all throughout the 28 member states. So each country would be helpful to that. The present time of the report was supposed to be a mechanism that would be published every 2 years. So the idea was the first one was in 2014, then we would have a second one in 2016, and member state would then be evaluated. What did they do with the recommendation that they got? And what then can be done in terms of moving forward. Now, many member states actually lobbied against having a report because they did not like to be called out that their country had problems with corruption, and specifically by the European Union. So what they did then was they lobbied, and the report was dropped. And in 2017, the European Union said, well, we are not going to deal anymore with corruption or, do this exercise of evaluating all of the policy areas that have issue with corruption, but we are going to move corruption as an issue in terms of evaluation to the European semester. So the European semester is a mechanism that really is about fiscal policies, where the European Union, together with countries of the Eurozone, together engage to make every year the budget. Now, when you look at the European semester, and the European semester draws every year a specific recommendation before the budget is adopted in each of the Eurozone countries, but all of them in a way that supports. Corruption as an issue was mentioned only in 13 out of 28 member states, and proposals were only made to 7 out of 28. Now, it's impossible that only 4 years ago, all 28 member states got a recommendation that, and also got called out that they had problem with corruption, and all of a sudden 21 eliminated it. So it doesn't make sense, right? So, however, why the EU dropped this, we can talk a little bit more afterwards. But it was also to do that Brexit was happening, as the cartoon that I've chosen. But also we had so many things going on in 2017, and the EU and some member states, they just didn't want it to have corruption around. And also the issue around this time was that populism was in full swing in the EU, and having a corruption report around calling out governments and so forth would be an issue. Now, the problem is that now corruption as an issue has moved to another mechanism in 2020 and has moved to the EU rule of law report, which we had the first one published in October 2020. And now corruption is one of the 4 pillars that the rule of law monitors. So you could see that corruption is being moved into 3 different mechanisms only in the last 3 years. And that kind of shows a little bit that it's not being taken as serious. But, that's where we are, unfortunately, with the EU policy. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Albania. So, in my chapters, you would see, I have divided into 3 different parts, and the chapter kind of explains, and the book pretty much is, are there real effort to develop an anti-corruption policy or not, and what sort of events have followed that they have tried. So Albania really became interested around this issue after the collapse of communism. And as you can see here, that there are 3 different parts. So between 1991 and 1997, it was more sort of an internal dealing with corruption. And then we had an international support after 1997 to 2009. And then from 2009, we have very much have an EU anti-corruption movement or support in Albania. And then we have the judicial reform since 2016. So with the first phase, so corruption as a issue appeared in the Albanian legislation in 1991. And then later in 1992, it was a bit more specified. Interestingly, after the collapse of communism, corruption appeared in the legislation, and its kind of, definition was that corruption was against the national interest, which very much is like a communist description or dealing with the corruption by the fact that it's called against the national interest. So how can you define that in court of law? It's very much open interpretation. The other one was that the National Intelligence Service, which was a secret police, but then later became a bit more open, was tasked to deal with the issue of corruption, which it doesn't quite make sense of why the National Intelligence Service should be dealing with that. So that was, and then in 1992, you also had a presidential decree by the President Berisha at the time, who signed into how we should prosecute and deal with corruption. Now, with these 2 legislation, as you could see in my book, these were very much used to prosecute some of the communist leaders at the time. And if you read in the book, the whole due process was not done accordingly, but it got support because it was sort of a way similar to, case of Al Capone, that they couldn't prosecute some of them because of the atrocities that they did during communism, but they kind of put them into court for the mismanagement of the humanitarian funds that they got after the collapse of communism. But then around 1995, the National Auditing Institution published a report, and here we could see that corruption was also viewed in administrative level. And here they acknowledge corruption that actually is taking place, and bribery, it's a real phenomenon within the public administration. And here around this time, also in Albania, the pyramid schemes, which they call them, but the Ponzi scheme, they really were taking a huge effect, and they could see that the bribery that they did with politicians at the time and public administration was having a real impact. And then the legislation around 1995 was changed. So this whole, concept of national interest was taken out, and bribery was brought in, and they kind of defined similar to what the international norms was. Now, in 1997, the Ponzi schemes or pyramid schemes that are known in Albania, they collapsed, but they accumulated nearly half of the GDP. And corruption was viewed as being one of the issue. And, there was the civil war in 1997 and so forth. Then in the Socialist Party took over, and because the Albanian economy as well as the whole society was in collapse, they got a lot of fundings and support by the international institution, in particular World Bank and IMF, and both of them gave Albanian government a loan, but they made specific conditions that good government's program again and anti-corruption strategies must be developed in order for them to get the loan. And here we could see the Albanian government for the first time developing an anti-corruption strategy. And the strategy actually was quite in-depth, but then, as we will talk later on, it's mainly most on paper rather than the application of it. Then around the early 2000s, the US also funded a lot of programs in Albania to teach the society about the issue of corruption, to fund directly NGOs that can help to engage with the broader community about anti-corruption movement and policies and initiatives. Now, interestingly, Albania in 2004 was actually the country in Southeast Europe that had adopted all international anti-corruption conventions and laws. So it was, you could say that on paper it was one of the leading one. However, its application were extremely low. Now, around that time, we had the first EU Western Balkan Summit in 2003. And from here on, the EU took a bit more interest in Albania when it comes to helping Albania in developing anti-corruption movement and as well as policies. Now, the association agreement came into force in 2009. And here, the European Commission really started to put to monitor Albania a lot more, and we could have this progress report, which were quite more depth. Now, here we could see that the EU really was influencing. And one of the first recommendations that the EU made to grant Albania the EU candidate status was the abolishment of immunities that politicians, judges, and other public administration enjoyed against prosecution. Now, this did go on about 2 years, and some politicians from both parties were against it. It was quite natural. Why? Because they would lose the immunity against prosecution. But then eventually they gave up, and they decided, because it was made quite clear by the EU that if they do not abolish that, and if they do not allow for the judiciary to prosecute anyone if they feel like it, or that they would not have the EU candidate status. So then that was abolished, and then shortly after, Albania got in 2014 the EU candidate status, so it was not anymore a potential candidate. Now, just for the record, the barometer shows that nearly 83% of Albanians support EU integration, and it's quite interesting. So there are not any parties in Albania that are against the EU, although there are from time to time different things. Now, with the EU candidate status, the EU came up and said that, well, they have 5 key priorities for Albania if they want to make further progress into EU integration. And they were around public administration, judiciary, fighting corruption, organized crime, and upholding the rule of law. Now, corruption is actually within 3 out of the 5 priorities. So you could say that, corruption makes a huge part of the 5 key priorities that Albania must show. Now, what it was made clear to Albania was that they must reform the judiciary, because the judiciary branch, which was seen as one of the most corrupt one, and one that is not independent, if they want to open accession talks. And so there was a whole, a year and a half of negotiation in parliament between parties and so forth to make the judicial reform. And in the end, in 2016, Albania changed nearly 1/3 of its constitution to enable the judicial reform. And the judicial reform now has created some new institution, and one of the most important of them is the Special Anti-Corruption and Organized Crime Structure, which in Albania is known as SPAC, and it's actually quite funded. And we will also have in the future the National Bureau of Investigation that should start work in the summer. And so there is some hope in there, but I can come back to this one because it was quite interesting in terms of, because it's very much divided at the moment. At the time, everyone voted in favor, but now there is a bit of a split in terms of the judicial reform. So that has really sort of captured what's going on. I just want to touch a little bit in terms of the judicial reform. So what that includes is they are reevaluating all of the judges and prosecutors in Albania, and it's an estimate of 800. And the criteria that they are going investigation are 3. So they are assessing their assets, so their money, properties, and so forth, their background, and their professional standards. Now, I checked, and in January, nearly 286 of the 800s had gone through the vetting process, and nearly half of them have either been dismissed or they have resigned. Now, in almost all of these cases, it has been because they could not justify their asset. And that has been viewed as them, accumulating their asset through corruption, so they got money to give a verdict. Now, it's a bit, the thing with that, but it's open to discussion, and I'm happy to have a discussion later on. But they are doing the same vetting now in the police, but we have to kind of know that half of the Albanian economy is informal. So to kind of find exactly how they owned or made every single cent, it's a bit difficult to establish, given that Albania economy, it's quite informal. But that's not to say that, these people that have been dismissed are anything like it. But I just want to point out that they've only been dismissed because of the asset, but none of them because they are not good professionals. And that it's a bit because there are quite a few judges that have given bad rulings. So why are they not being taken out of that? But we can come back to this discussion as well. So it's just to say, and I talk a little bit about this more in my paper, and I'm happy to share the paper in the chat, which was published by the Hague Rule of Law in November. Now, the problem with the EU anti-corruption efforts in hybrid regimes as Albania is because, well, democracy in countries like Albania and like in many countries of the Western Balkans, I call it, in a way, it has been democratized backwards, because the communism collapsed, we immediately hold elections, and because we hold a few elections that we can elect some, out or in of the office, that does not mean that we establish independent institutions that can subscribe to democratic norms or that the rule of law is set up. So if we kind of didn't give time for independent institutions to be developed, it's a bit difficult to now go back and do this whole reevaluation with a hope that once the judiciary is independent, they could hold into account, governmental leaders. Second thing is that the Western Balkan countries, or for that matter, countries that have hybrid regime, are quite clever in a way that they just pass any international supported or recommended anti-corruption policies without really subscribing to them. So they are in a way a facade that they're sort of paying a lip service to this institution just to please them, that they are doing something on paper. But then when it comes to enforcing them, they are just not there. Then both on my chapters, I talk a little bit about this, and this kind of shows why, for instance, in 2004, Albania had passed all international standards, and it was sort of the leading country in Southeast Europe that had adopted this. Even some countries in the EU had not adopted this, but yet, corruption was out of hand. So these are sort of some of it. Now, in terms of having some concluding remarks, both for the Western Balkan and for the EU, EU conditionalities do not work effectively, because you're basically asking, when you look at the EU conditions, for a candidate country to adopt nearly 400 new laws, and then these laws then are in line with the EU standard. But that's just, transporting. The whole point then should be to implement them. Another, and I talk a little bit about in my paper for the Hague Rule of Law, which is open access and everyone can see it, is that there's not proper evaluation that, okay, so we pass the laws, we make some legislation, but what about having proper budgets for these institutions that they can do the job? So for instance, in the case of Albania, the judiciary and law enforcement, for that matter, they got $22 per capita. And when we compare it with the other countries, or the average in Europe, it's 70 euros. So when we look at some of the budget that the law enforcement gets in the Western Balkans, it's very much for them to just pay the wages of their employees and, rent for their building and so forth. And there isn't much left to do an investigation. And we know that if you want to do an investigation into high organized crime unit or high corruption cases, the resources are just not there. So the EU has to be a bit more aware in terms of this. The other part is that, well, the EU, of course, wants to work with governments, but they sometimes are complicit with some of these governments, which they turn into corrupt elites. Because, in the Balkans, it's very much they want to keep this, peace kind of an idea. And they think that, well, if we have some kind of autocrat there that just doesn't bother us too much and keeps it in shape, would be all right. And we see that the EU, it's also having its own problems with some of its member states, and particularly with Poland, as well as with Hungary. The other one is that civil society has to be empowered a bit more, and a multi-level government's approach and reflexive governments, which I talk in the theory, has to be evaluated. What we mean by that is that you engage with NGOs and civil societies that go beyond the sort of capital. Because if you see most of the EU institutions, they just like to go to the city, in particular into the capital city, and then they meet some NGOs, which some of these NGOs or think tanks are very much a recycle of previous government officials from one of the parties that they are just there employed. And so it's not proper engagement. So a last remark on the EU, which the book is very much about. Well, has the EU addressed corruption? In 2014, they did, but since then, it's been sabotaged. And corruption is not viewed anymore as a social problem. And my area is socio-legal. So corruption is still being viewed as an issue that affects the internal market and the business and economic growth. So it's viewed from economic terms. It's not viewed that it has a societal impact. Corruption should also be viewed that it has an impact on the union's values. So the EU talks about having rule of law values, democracy, human rights, and so forth. But corruption erodes that. And if that's not properly addressed, and if it is not seen beyond the economic terms, we will have an issue. The other and final comment that I want to make, the EU must do better coordination also with international organization. And it should align, for instance, like how the UN does that with having these goals, so like 2030 or 2015 and so forth. Because what we see, and we also see this when you look at my Albanian chapter, we also see sort of different member states and different institutions funding the same thing. So the resources are just wasted there. So there has to be a better coordination. And the problem is that in the EU at the moment, we see that Germany and France are split in terms of what the vision of the EU is. So that also has sort of an impact of what we might have going on in the future. But I'm happy to leave it here, my presentation.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hoxhaj. Very interesting. The reason I wanted Dr. Hoxhaj to present his book is because, as we know, in the Western Balkans, corruption is endemic throughout the region and has a corrosive effect on all the factors that you've mentioned, in particular on rule of law and human rights. It's quite a deconstruction. I congratulate you on your deconstruction of EU policy. They basically adopted one and then just abandoned it. In terms of coordination, since there's so much focus on markets and its internal, in terms of financial institutions, but what about on the criminal side? Has this yielded to more coordination with Interpol or international law agencies, including, efforts with the UN? What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for your kind remark and question. In terms of Europol, it's getting more and more involved in the Western Balkans, and they are doing some joint operation, in particular when it comes to organized crime. And corruption is viewed as sort of an enabler that allows the police, to cooperate with some of these organized crime networks. The thing is, though, that there is a lot of distrust between international institutions and Western Balkans institutions, and that leads to ineffective policy. Reason being is because some of these Western Balkan countries are viewed as highly corrupt, and as well as involved in some of these organizations themselves. So that is a bit of an issue, and I've encountered that from my engagement while writing this book, as well as for my ongoing research. And we did a workshop together on organized crime.
Yes, we did.
In New York a year and a half ago. And that is being viewed as an issue. In terms of moving forward, yes, I totally agree that an international approach has to be taken into account, because some of these efforts have to be that way because it impacts. I mean, look, for instance, in the country where I live, I mean, here they are viewing Albanian organized crime as a real issue, and they, you could see that it's coming from the Balkans up to here. And I was reading the other day in Sweden, they are having a similar issue at the moment now with organized crime from the Western Balkan, because some arms and guns made in Albania were found in some of the cities in Sweden. So a better approach that has to be done. But more importantly, or at least from our area, we should also collaborate more with one another in terms of the research area that we do, as well as teasing out some of this issue and putting them into a proper context. Because what I see, for instance, when I read some of the papers here in the UK, they try to, for instance, when it comes to Albania, they put this BESA concepts into the organized crime world, which has nothing to do with it. Or they put, for instance, I was reading the other day something quite interesting. They would put the canon into it because they wanted to give this, like, the similar mafia of Italy into it. But when you look at the canon is only for a specific area in north of Albania.
Right.
So it's not, throughout. So there has to also be a better understanding. But the thing is, though, some of these organizations, at least from my engagement, for instance, Europol that you mentioned, they kind of believe that. They think that, the canon sort of code of ethics, or whatever you want to call it, applies to all Albanian, which is, it's not true.
One more question and comment. You pointed out on Twitter, and of course it's been in the news, that Tony Blinken, Secretary of State, this past week acknowledged the work of an Albanian judge. I thought that was an interesting thing for him to point out in the first 5 weeks since he's taken office as Secretary of State. That should probably be an indicator to Albania what is on Americans' minds. But also, with regard to your comment about more NGO engagement, and I could not agree more, I think that the distance between governments and NGOs needs to be narrowed dramatically, and there should be much more engagement and feedback. And one of the ways, of course, is in journalism, by utilizing a freedom of access to information, more transparency by governments, but also talking to them, because this corruption affects every citizen's life, their family, their communities. I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that, Dr. Hoxhaj.
I mean, the award of Secretary of State, it was a very interesting one. The way I view it, or I read it, is that the US is sending a message that they are very much looking into the judicial reform. But we must also say this, that judicial reform in Albania would have not happened without the United States government support and without its funding. So I think in post-communist Albania, the biggest investment that the US has made is the judicial reform. Because the anti-corruption structure that have been set up, the US has actually put resources, money into it, and the bureau that it's going to be set up, it's very much modeled around the FBI. And some of these folks that are going to work in the bureau, they will be trained down in the FBI Academy in Virginia. So that's why it's taking a bit of a problem. So that's sort of an indication to me that I say that they are looking at this, and this is one of the biggest investment. In terms of the individual itself, yes, it is a bit because in Albania, both parties at the moment are quite split into the judicial reform. So the opposition, it's a bit against it, but we have election coming up, and still they have not answered what they will do afterwards. But the indication is that they will not touch the reform because there's a lot of resources both from the US and the EU.
So we do have a question on that from one of our from the audience about about the upcoming the upcoming elections, and this question is about corruption and voting behavior. Is, in your opinion, will the recent corruption cases, especially in the judicial and healthcare sector, affect voting behavior in Albania?
It's a very interesting question. Yes and no. Yes, it would have an impact, because when we see every election, most of the government run on an anti-corruption platform. And at least when we have had one government coming in and one going out, and you would see that in my chapter, specifically in 1997, in 2005, and 2013, they have been voted out because of scandals on corruption. But this election are an interesting one, because the question should not really be put that, but should it be, whoever we vote, are they going to be more inclined or in favor for state capture? And that it's probably what we have to look at. In my opinion about this, and I just want to make a brief comment on this, is that I do not have a proper answer for this, and I'm not convinced that none of them, the current government or the opposition, will not be tempted to further state capture. Why? Because there are some behaviors that both have done that I am skeptical. So for one, the government's record are there and they are well documented. Whereas the opposition, they resigned in bloc their seat in parliament a couple of years ago, and they resigned because of their party leader wanted to in both parties. So if the party leader, without any proper discussion within their own party, which I think democracy should be within a political party first, and that gives you an indication, followed suit with a leader, that kind of shows you what they can do if they come into government. So in terms of state capture. But it would be an interesting election, and I think the corruption would have an impact, because we have seen quite a lot of cases, and in the healthcare system, with which the question was raised, and I do also mention it a little bit in my book.
In your paper, yeah, in the book too.
It will have an impact, because now it's wide in the open. Before we could see that in the healthcare there was corruption, but now we can actually see reports and we see video how they've been mistreated and so forth. So that would have an impact, and I think the behavior in some of these places would have an impact.
You're talking about people's lives. You're talking about life and death situations where, if access is not available, or if you are exploited as a medical patient, that's just a horrific experience for people. That would be, I think, very, very personal, and could in fact drive voting behavior.
Absolutely. I saw one case which I was horrified, that someone's dad died by COVID, and they had stolen his pocket. So it's money that he had in the pocket. And not only that, but the credit card, and they have went to the ATM and taken out nearly 300 euros from a dead person that died in hospital of COVID. So that story really, pull the trigger, and I'm sure it will have an impact in voters' behavior. But if people will remember it in a couple of months, unless, the media will stream something else.
Well, the opposition's job is to remind the electorate. Let me just say a couple other questions. One is, you already discussed how paltry the EU was on law enforcement in terms of the proportion of funds. In other words, they can only really pay police and maybe for their facility cover the rent. This question from Rafael Quintero is if we consider that it's in the best interest of the EU and Albania to combat corruption? Could it be a feasible idea that the EU grant loans or directly fund anti-corruption agencies in Albania, considering that money-wise, Albania does not have the means?
Yes, I absolutely, in short, would say yes, but I think it would be more in terms of having resources and proper training. So for instance, as far as I know, and at least from my research and my engagement, is that they do not have some expert in specific fields. So for instance, for financial crimes, so the unit of the financial crime, it's quite underfunded and underdeveloped. So I would say resources, not just money-wise, but also proper training and providing tools that they could do proper investigation would help. I mean, the Academy for Security, which is sort of between the police and the defense, which trains this investigator and so forth, it's very much underfunded and under-resourced. So that would really, help.
Can you take a question on Romania?
Sure.
Okay, we have a question here on Romania from Nadim Hoxhaj. How would Mr. Hoxha rate the current developments in Romania in terms of judicial fight against corruption? Has it slowed down? And what consequences might this entail?
Romania is a very interesting case. And Romania, it's, looking at historically, developed a very effective anti-corruption agency. And as I discussed in my book, the Romania has prosecuted over 4,700 officials against corruption, and they've put in behind bars over 17. That there were ministers and prime ministers and so forth. The issue at the moment in Romania is that it has slowed a bit down for various reasons. And with the new government that came in, they kind of politicized the issue again, because already it was, but they were seen and it was having this sort of broader appeal in Romania that corruption was an issue. However, what I have faith in Romania is that Romania has a very strong civil society, and there is a strong reaction. So we saw the protest against it. And we know when there is protest and more pressure is put into the government, usually there is a reaction. So I have faith that Romanians will get back to where they were going in that trajectory. So sometimes there are some misstep, but it's good that they have a mobilized civil society and they react against these things.
So I'd like to go back and get a response from you. You mentioned in terms of enlargement and the criteria for enlargement, you say there's a difference between Macron and the German chancellor. And she is on her way out. So what are your thoughts on that? I mean, first of all, last fall, let's just go back to last year when North Macedonia and Albanians' applications were denied and blocked by Macron, who was backed by the Dutch and the Danes and Luxembourg as a way to, and actually it was EU politics quite visibly as I think a block towards Germany too. It was a block on the chancellor. So you're right. There's this mixed agenda here, and I think the fallout did come down on Albania and North Macedonia. What are your thoughts on that? It's not directly about corruption. It's a broader issue of the geopolitics operating in the EU right now on enlargement.
Usually the approach of Germany, it's pro-European and pro-enlargement, because they believe that if more countries join in, there is more effort towards going to that direction. So I do not think that by Chancellor Merkel going and her successor coming in, whoever it might be, the policy of Germany will change. So I do not think that would be the problem. The issue is, though, Macron in this area, he wants to sort of become a player and more dominant, and he wants to strengthen his position. So he used that quite cleverly, and it was more about the enlargement. And when they blocked Albania and Northern Macedonia, it was more because he's looking to do more reform on the Eurozone, and Germany, as well as the Netherlands and these other countries, do not want to do those reforms in the Eurozone. So that was more. But just to pick a little bit up, and we have had this discussion together, think a little bit about who blocked Albania and Northern Macedonia. So it was France, Denmark, and the Netherlands.
Yes.
So these are three countries that have passed, or at least tried to, the most anti-Muslim laws in their own countries.
I'm glad you're bringing this up. Yes, please.
Right?
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
So has done Denmark, so has done France, and so has done the Netherlands. So we can say, okay, so maybe the Netherlands have a beef with Albania because there is a organized crime network working in the Netherlands, and there might be some claims there. In France, there are not many Albanians living, hardly. And in Denmark, not at all.
Right.
So I don't see any issue. But if you talk to them, that they would immediately point out that Albania is a Muslim country, or they would say Northern Macedonia, its majority, or has a good
a sizable minority.
Same with Bosnia and Herzegovina when we had the discussion together, right?
Without question.
So there's a deeper issue there, and there is sort of this Islamophobia in the EU foreign policy, specifically in enlargement. Now they don't want to talk about this, and obviously
they don't want to admit it. Absolutely,
and they don't want to admit that
publicly because they know they can't.
Yeah. But we know in back rooms, and we know that in seminars that me and you sometimes hold with these people, that's very much their impression.
I totally agree with you. A last comment on that. It's a good time. I'm very big on the American-UK partnership in the Western Balkans. It's been a very productive one. Unfortunately, and you know this because you live in the UK, is that they've been sidelined by Brexit. And of course, in the first conversation that President Biden had with Prime Minister Johnson, he brought up the issue of Bosnia. And so we shall see, but I do believe that the reemergence of this partnership, I think, is really important to the region. And what's also interesting, Andy, that we haven't really addressed is that, let's be quite frank, the Albanians in Albania and in Kosovo, and to a greater extent, even in North Macedonia, are very pro-US. They are the most pro-US populations in the Western Balkans. So I'm sure, despite whatever concerns corrupt officials might have in Albania, they're probably glad the Americans are back under Joe Biden. It's going to be interesting to see what happens, but congratulations to you on this wonderful book. And if people are diplomats in the Western Balkans, they should buy a copy of it. It should be a handbook for people in Brussels and in Strasbourg, I might add. And I congratulate you and wish you all the best. What are you working on now? Unfortunately, we're going to have to wrap it up, but what are your research interests right now? What are you doing?
Right now, I just finished the paper and I sent it to a journal, which is on the Western Balkan Common Market. So very briefly on that, the EU in November, after the Berlin Process Summit, they've adopted to establish a regional common market in the Western Balkan, which is modeled after the EU single market. So more or less, they want to create this regional market based on EU rules, and that then would be a springboard into having access to the EU common market. It's a very interesting one, and particularly when you look at the some of the action plans and some of the laws that they're asking have to be with a blockchain. Some of them have to be with supply chain, and a lot with car manufacturers. So that's kind of an indication that maybe the EU wants to move some of its supply chain from China and bring them in the Balkan. But we shall see, because this will be working in 24, 25, so in 4 or 5 years. So I think in the next 2 years would be very interesting to see that development. But I think that's worth a workshop in Colombia.
I agree with that. And actually, that's back to the future, because I think it's a natural market. It's the former Yugoslav market. But, you know, it needs to be updated to EU in integration into the European system. It's really great to have you. I'm sorry we were delayed. Despite the pandemic, we said, no, we're going to host you and hear your thoughts, and we wish you all the best. And
thank you very much.
Thank you. And I'd just like to announce to our audience and any Harriman students that at the end of March, we will be hosting Catherine Baumberger, the Director General of the International Commission on Missing Persons, an American legacy institution that began in Bosnia and is now an intergovernmental agency in The Hague. Thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. And again, great to see you, Andy, and take care.
Thank you very much. Lovely seeing you. And I hope next time it's in person.
Me too. Hear, hear. All the best, everybody.
All the best. Take care.
Bye.